study rare plants throughout the whole state of Washington. Of course, the state of Washington is a big place, and so I work very closely with local people that know particular areas much better than I can. So from those local people, I get the knowledge of particular places, and then what I can contribute is I have a statewide perspective, because that's my job, to travel around the state. So we put those two kind of pieces of information together to come up with our best ideas for what is valuable from a conservation point of view. So I wanted to basically do two things. My two main objectives for me talking is one, to tell you a little bit about how it came to be that Trombetta Canyon was identified as an area that we think has conservation value. And then to tell you a little bit about the features that are there, particular rare species. I'll tell you also a little bit about our process, which Benny talked about also, of how we go through describing an area, saying this is the area we want to make into a national area, and then how that gets presented as a boundary to the public. So anyway, as backup, I came over here in 2006, and there was a Native Plant Society meeting that was going to happen, and the local people in Paulville, the local botanist, asked if I would lead a field trip. And she said, you know, a really good place to take one would be to Trombetta Canyon. It's Department of Natural Resources land. That's what I work for. And it was, she had actually proposed it sometime before, I think it was in the 1990s, proposed it as a natural area because it had been studied by another botanist. She had found a bunch of rare species. They said this is worthy of making into a preserve. Let's recommend it to the Natural Heritage Program. At that time, we really didn't have the staff or the capacity to consider it or to look at it. So it's just kind of set on the back burner. And then in 2006, when I came in, I went into the canyon and looked at the rare species. And then I went back to my program and I said, well, what do you think? Do you think this is worthy of conservation? And then the ecologists from our program came out, they looked at it, and we talked to the rest of the program, the management, and we thought, yeah, this is worth moving ahead with and recommending for conservation. One other thing I'd like to say about it right now, I think is a good time to do it, is that we try to take a common sense approach. And one of the real benefits or the features of Trombetta Canyon that is appealing is that there wasn't a huge value in timber or other resources that might be lost by putting it into conservation. The canyon itself really is not valuable in other ways. But the only value I can see long-term is it potentially could be a source of limestone. And so that's maybe one thing that it would be protected against, likely, is mining for that limestone. So anyway, this is an overview. We're up here in the northwest corner. I expect you folks all know where we are. Up in the Canadian Rockies. And to me, this is a real interesting area because it is a lot like the Canadian Rockies. The geology, the vegetation. It's really different than anywhere else in Washington. And this is just general information. Just for curiosity, how many of you have been to Trombetta Canyon? You've actually been in the canyon? So quite a few, yeah. Interestingly, most of you haven't, and most people haven't. It's not a place that people go to. There is no public access. When I go there, I have to ask permission of the adjacent landowners. And so far, they've always said yes, and I could cross their land. But if they said no, that would be the end of my inquiry. I really couldn't just cross their land even, get to their land. But you all know where it is. It's where you practically can see part from here. Topographic map right here in Northport. And Trombetta Canyon really cuts through this big limestone formation. And very interesting geologically. It's like a canyon that has no source of water to cut it. And I don't know the history of how that came to be. This is an aerial photograph of it. It really is like a mountain, really a limestone, big limestone formation with a very deep canyon cutting through it. And the canyon, as some of you know, drains to the north, drains into this wetland at the bottom. There's no surface water, it's dry canyon. And at the very tip of it, the drainage heads the other way, it heads to the south. So there's a boundary that we have drawn. Maybe I'll back up and show you just a little bit about the process. When I look at it as a biologist, I really don't even look at what the ownership is. I mean, I know it's mostly DNR, I know there's private land around it. But we try to look at the feature we're trying to protect, which are the rare species, which I'll describe. And then we draw a line on the map. We say, well, in order to protect this species, this is where we draw a line. And it's not a square line. It's sometimes a very irregular line. And we call that the ecological boundary, irrespective of ownership or anything, any practical consideration. And then we take out the ownership maps and we look at what makes sense for a line that we might be able to work with. For example, this line right here, this jagged line, when we first drew the ecological boundary, we just included the formation, the limestone formation. But we did want to, you can't really survey a crooked line, so we just squared it off by section and quarter section along that line as well as we could, just to be practical. So that cuts off across several other ownerships. And so this map shows you the ownership, at least the public ownership, which is this hatch marked area, this penny set, which is Department of Natural Resources Trust land. This shows the exact same thing on an aerial photograph. And I don't know the history. You all probably know that when sometime in the formation of the state government, in Section 16, most Section 16 is with the state ownership. And I don't know the history of, there may be people here who do, the history of how this happened to be adjusted, when this was taken out, and this was added in. If you do know, if you want to tell me afterwards, I'd be very curious to know how that happened to come about. So from my perspective as a botanist, there are 3 species of particular concern. We've spent, many people have spent a lot of the time since the 1970s trying to determine what's rare in Washington. When we first started out, people made a list of what they thought might be rare species, worthy of conservation. We started developing a database, collecting records. We found that some of those things weren't rare at all. We took them off the list. We found that some things were quite rare, and we added them on. So we've had this process of review every 2 years. We're required by state law to revisit our list, take things off that we found to be more abundant. So it's a very lengthy process requiring the efforts of many, many people. But these are the species, which I'll show you pictures of. There's a hoary willow, yellow mountain avens, and a Steller's rock break. It's very likely that none of you have ever seen any of these or maybe have a particular interest in them, but it's our focus of what my job is to look for those. And then there's 3 plant associations, different types of forests that have been identified as such by the ecologists. And then there's this calciferous wetland at the bottom, just meaning it's because of the limestone, it's got a particular kind of chemistry. This is a topographic map. Of course, the other thing, besides the rare plants and the plant communities, are just the feature itself. It's an unusual feature. I know to you, living in this part of the state, limestone is not a rare thing. There's a lot of limestone around here. But if you look at it from our perspective, the statewide perspective, it is a very rare rock type. It's actually often the case that some of the most rare species we have are not rare in a particular farmer's field. It just happens to be that if you look at it from a broader perspective, it's extremely rare. So that's what we try to bring to the process. So this is the first one. It's called hoary willow. It's the only time I've ever seen it. There's 4 known occurrences in Washington. One of them is fairly large. The other 3 are small. This one is the only one in this part of the state. The other 3 are over in the far part of Monterey County. And it extends into the United States and other states, but it's rare in 4 or 5 other states that have identified this as a rare species. It grows in that calcareous swamp or marsh at the bottom of that canyon. This one is called Yellow Mountain Avens. It's a yellow flowered plant. Grows up on the limestone cliffs. It's only known from limestone, and I've never seen it before. I came to Trombetta Canyon. There's around 5 known occurrences in the state of Washington. It may be that there's others that we have never found because we only are able to survey where we're able to go. And then the third one is Stellar's rock rake, which is a fern, small fern, also grows on limestone. There's around 6 or 8 occurrences in Washington, very widely scattered. There's 1 or 2 in the Olympics, 1 or 2 in the North Cascades, and then I think there's one other one in this northeast corner, besides Trombetta. So those 3 species together, when I went there and saw them, they were not in our database before. That brought it to my attention that this was an area that had some of these components. They're not the only places that they occur, but they do grow in a place where it seemed to me practical to try to conserve them there. As you know, the canyon is pretty remote. There's not any other development in the canyon itself. It's fairly isolated. Doesn't have great economic value. So it made a lot of sense to me. This is another one. This is another kind of fern that just grows on limestone. It's not rare. We don't track it in our database. But it is characteristic of this type of formation. And this is another fern that is fairly uncommon. It's also not extremely rare, but it's one that when we encounter it, we notice it. And then the forest, which was a secondary consideration, or a first consideration in looking at this as a national area with the rare plants growing on this place. When we started looking around at the adjacent forest, then we thought that there were lots of reasons to include that in the boundary. Those forests do have more economic value, obviously, but they're a type of forest that's not well represented in our preserve system. It's a fairly small, separate patch of it. So it made sense to us to include that in the boundary of the tree. And there's 3 different plant communities in that forest. Those are just the understory of the 9-bark, the twin flower. And then what I think is very unusual and valuable from a conservation point of view is a freshwater wetland at the bottom. Because it's fed by limestone, we see the willow is in there, which would only be there because of the limestone. There's a bunch of other species that are not rare, but are characteristic. What we often find in a place like this is that we first learned about it because of 1 or 2 species, but then as we go there, we're able to study it. Often we find a cluster of other things, like there are different kinds of invertebrates that are characteristic of limestone formed wetlands. We've never looked for those, but we almost invariably find, once you start studying an area intensely that already has rare things, that we find more of them. They kind of come together, which is part of the rationale for setting aside areas, that you pick up the resources you know about, but you also pick up the things that you don't yet know about. And then the formation, which I've talked about before. And I described the process of how we drew this boundary. This boundary is, as Penny has said, as we will talk about it much more. It's just an area that we consider worthy of protection. It doesn't impose any regulation. It doesn't give us any rights to say to you what you can do in the land. But it identifies it in a formal way that this has been identified as being valuable. And what that usually means in a practical sense is if there's money available, which these days we're all feeling isn't necessarily available, but we've already gone through a process of identifying this as valuable. So we can move quickly if there is a seller that wants to sell and we have money, we can go ahead without having to go through this whole lengthy, years-long process of review. So that's it. And turn it back to Penny, and we'll be here as long as you want tonight.